The Richmond-Petersburg Campaign was a series of battles around Petersburg, Virginia, fought from June 9, 1864, to March 25, 1865, during the American Civil War. Although it is more popularly known as the Siege of Petersburg, it was not a classic military siege, in which a city is usually surrounded and all supply lines are cut off, nor was it strictly limited to actions against Petersburg. The campaign consisted of 9 months of trench warfare in which Union forces commanded by Lt.Gen. Ulysses S. Grant assaulted Petersburg unsuccessfully and then constructed trench lines that eventually extended over 30 miles from the eastern outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, to around the eastern and southern outskirts of Petersburg. Petersburg was crucial to the supply of Confederate Gen. Robert E. Lee's army and the Confederate capital of Richmond. Numerous raids were conducted and battles fought in attempts to cut off the railroad supply lines through Petersburg to Richmond, and many of these caused the lengthening of the trench lines, overloading dwindling Confederate resources. Lee finally gave in to the pressure and abandoned both cities in April 1865, leading to his retreat and surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The Siege of Petersburg foreshadowed the trench warfare that was common in World War I, earning it a prominent position in military history. It also featured the war's largest concentration of African American troops, who suffered heavy casualties at such engagements as the Battle of the Crater and Chaffin's Farm. Background: military situation. In March 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to lieutenant general and was given command of the Union Army. He devised a coordinated strategy to apply pressure on the Confederacy from many points, something President Abraham Lincoln had urged his generals to do from the beginning of the war. Grant put Gen. William T. Sherman in immediate command of all forces in the West and moved his own headquarters to be with the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, where he intended to maneuver Lee's army to a decisive battle. His secondary objective was to capture Richmond, but Grant knew that the latter would happen automatically once the former was accomplished. His coordinated strategy called for Grant and Meade to attack Lee from the north, while Gen. Benjamin Butler drove toward Richmond from the southeast. Gen. Franz Sigel to control the Shenandoah Valley, Sherman to invade Georgia, defeat Gen. Joseph E. Johnston, and capture Atlanta. Gens. George Crook and William W. Averell to operate against railroad supply lines in West Virginia, and Gen. Nathaniel P. Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama. Most of these initiatives failed, often because of the assignment of generals to Grant for political rather than military reasons. Butler's Army of the James bogged down against inferior forces under Gen. P.G.T. Beauregard before Richmond, Indiana, of the Bermuda Hundred Campaign. Sigel was soundly defeated at the Battle of New Market in May, and soon afterward he was replaced by Gen. David Hunter. Banks was distracted by the Red River Campaign and failed to move on Mobile. However, Crook and Averell were able to cut the last railway linking Virginia and Tennessee, and Sherman's Atlanta campaign was a success, although it dragged on through the fall. On May 4, Grant and Meade's Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River and entered the area known as the Wilderness of Spotsylvania, beginning the 6-week overland campaign. At the bloody but tactically inconclusive Battle of the Wilderness and Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, Grant failed to destroy Lee's army but, unlike his predecessors, did not retreat after the battles. He repeatedly moved his army leftward to the southeast in a campaign that kept Lee on the defensive and moved ever closer to Richmond. Grant spent the remainder of May maneuvering and fighting minor battles with the Confederate Army as he attempted to turn Lee's flank and lure him into the open. Grant knew that his larger army and base of manpower in the North could sustain a war of attrition better than Lee and the Confederacy could. This theory was tested at the Battle of Cold Harbor when Grant's army once again came into contact with Lee's near Mechanicsville. He chose to engage Lee's army directly by ordering a frontal assault on the Confederate fortified positions on June 3. This attack was repulsed with heavy losses. Cold Harbor was a battle that Grant regretted more than any other, and Northern newspapers thereafter frequently referred to him as a butcher. Although Grant suffered high losses during the campaign, approximately 50,000 casualties, or 41%, Lee lost even higher percentages of his men, approximately 32,000, or 46%, losses that could not be replaced. On the night of June 12, Grant again advanced by his left flank, marching to the James River. He planned to cross to the south bank of the river, bypassing Richmond, and isolate Richmond by seizing the railroad junction of Petersburg to the south. While Lee remained unaware of Grant's intentions, the Union Army constructed a pontoon bridge 2,100 feet long and crossed the James River on June 14 to 18. What Lee had feared most of all, that Grant would force him into a siege of Richmond, was poised to occur. Petersburg, a prosperous city of 18,000, was a supply center for Richmond, given its strategic location just south of Richmond, its site on the Appomattox River that provided navigable access to the James River, and its role as a major crossroads and junction for 5 railroads, since Petersburg was the main supply base and rail depot for the entire region, including Richmond. The taking of Petersburg by Union forces would make it impossible for Lee to continue defending Richmond. This represented a change of strategy from that of the preceding overland campaign, in which confronting and defeating Lee's army in the open was the primary goal. Now, Grant selected a geographic and political target and knew that his superior resources could besiege Lee there, pin him down, and either starve him into submission or lure him out for a decisive battle. Lee at first believed that Grant's main target was Richmond and devoted only minimal troops under Gen. P.G.T. Beauregard to the defense of Petersburg. Opposing forces. Union. At the beginning of the campaign, Grant's Union forces consisted of the Army of the Potomac under Lt.Gen. George G. Meade, and the Army of the James under Lt.Gen. Benjamin Butler. The Army of the Potomac included 2nd Corps under Lt.Gen. Winfield S. Hancock, including the divisions of Lt.Gens. David B. Birney and John Gibbon, and Brig.Gen. Francis C. Barlow. 5th Corps under Lt.Gen. Governor K. Warren, including the divisions of Brig.Gens. Charles Griffin, Romaine B. Ayres, Samuel W. Crawford, and Lysander Cutler. 6th Corps under Lt.Gen. Horatio G. Wright, including the divisions of Brig.Gens. David A. Russell, Thomas H. Neal, and James B. Ricketts. 9th Corps under Lt.Gen. Ambrose Burnside, including the divisions of Brig.Gens. James H. Ledley, Robert B. Potter, Orlando B. Wilcox, and Edward Ferrero. Lt.Gen. John G. Park replaced Burnside after the Battle of the Crater. Cavalry Corps under Lt.Gen. Philip H. Sheridan, including the divisions of Brig.Gens. Alfred T. A. Talbot, David M. C. M. Gregg, and James H. Wilson. Sheridan and much of his command were on detached service in the Shenandoah Valley from mid-July 1864 to late March 1865. Upon the return, Sheridan often referred to his cavalry corps as the Army of the Shenandoah, reflecting the role in the Valley campaigns of 1864. The Army of the James included 10th Corps under Brig. Gen. Alfred H. Terry, including the divisions of Brig. Gens. Robert S. Foster and Adelbert Ames. 18th Corps under Maj. Gen. William F. Baldy Smith, including the divisions of Brig. Gens. William T. H. Brooks, John H. Martindale, and Edward W. Hinks. 24th Corps under Maj. Gen. Edward O. C. Ord, including the divisions of Brig. Gen. Robert S. Foster, Maj. Gen. Thomas M. Harris, and Brig. Gen. Charles Devens. 25th Corps under Maj. Gen. Godfrey Whitesell, including the divisions of Brig. Gens. Charles J. Payne, William Birney, and Edward A. Wild. Cavalry Division under Brig. Gen. August Coutts. On December 3, 1864, the racially integrated 10th Corps and 18th Corps were reorganized to become the all-white 24th Corps and the all-black 25th Corps. Grant made his headquarters in a cabin on the lawn of Appomattox Manor, the home of Dr. Richard Epson, the oldest home in what was then City Point, but is now Hopewell, Virginia. Lee's Confederate force consisted of his own Army of Northern Virginia, as well as a scattered, disorganized group of 10,000 men defending Richmond under Gen. P.G.T. Beauregard. Many of the men under Beauregard's command consisted of soldiers who were either too young or too old to fight in the Army of Northern Virginia, or men who had been discharged from Lee's army due to wounds that rendered them unfit for service. The Army of Northern Virginia was initially organized into 4 corps. 1st Corps under Lt.Gen. Richard H. Anderson, including the divisions of Maj. Gens. George E. Pickett, Charles W. Field, and Joseph B. Kershaw. Lt.Gen. James Longstreet returned from medical leave and resumed command of the Corps on October 19. Anderson was given command of the new 4th Corps, which included the division of Maj. Gen. Bushrod Johnson. 2nd Corps, under Lt.Gen. Jubal A. Early, was detached on June 12 for operations in the Shenandoah Valley and played no direct role in the defense of Petersburg. 3rd Corps, under Lt.Gen. A. P. Hill, including the divisions of Maj. Gens. Henry Heath and Cadmus M. Wilcox and Brig. Gen. William Mahone. Cavalry Corps under Maj. Gen. Wade Hampton, including the divisions of Maj. Gens. Fitzhugh Lee and W. H. F. Rooney Lee. Beauregard's Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia had 4 depleted divisions commanded by Maj. Gens. Robert Ransom, Jr., Robert F. Hoke, and William H. C. Whiting, and Brig. Gen. Alfred H. Colquhoun. Comparison between Union and Confederate armies. Grant's armies were significantly larger than Lee's during the campaign, although the strengths varied. During the initial assaults on the city, 15,000 Federal troops faced about 5,400 men under Beauregard. By June 18, the Federal strength exceeded 67,000 against the Confederate 20,000. More typical of the full campaign was in mid-July, when 70,000 Union troops faced 36,000 Confederates around Petersburg, and 40,000 men under Butler faced 21,000 around Richmond. The Union Army, despite suffering horrific losses during the Overland Campaign, was able to replenish its soldiers and equipment, taking advantage of garrison troops from Washington, D.C., and the increasing availability of African American soldiers. By the end of the siege, Grant had 125,000 men to begin the Appomattox Campaign. The Confederate Army, in contrast, had difficulty replacing men lost through battle, disease, and desertion. As a result of this severe lack of manpower facing the Confederates, when Beauregard's men occupied the trenches around the city, there were gaps in the line of up to 5 feet between men. Initial attempts to capture Petersburg. Butler's assault. While Lee and Grant faced each other after Cold Harbor, Benjamin Butler became aware that Confederate troops had been moving north to reinforce Lee, leaving the defenses of Petersburg in a vulnerable state. Sensitive to his failure in the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, Butler sought to achieve a success to vindicate his generalship. He wrote, "The capture of Petersburg lay near my heart." Petersburg was protected by multiple lines of fortifications, the outermost of which was known as the Dimmock Line, a line of earthworks and trenches 10 miles long, with 55 redoubts east of the city. The 2,500 Confederates stretched thin along this defensive line were commanded by a former Virginia governor, Brig.Gen. Henry A. Wise. Despite the number of fortifications, because of a series of hills and valleys around the outskirts of Petersburg, there were several places along the outer defenses where cavalry could easily ride through undetected until they reached the inner defenses of the city. Butler's plan was formulated on the afternoon of June 8, 1864, calling for 3 columns to cross the Appomattox and advance with 4,500 men. The first and second consisted of infantry from March.Gen. Quincy A. Gillmore's 10th Corps and U.S. colored troops from Brig.Gen. Edward W. Hinks's 3rd Division of 18th Corps, which was to attack the Dimmock Line east of the city. The 3rd was 1,300 cavalrymen under Brig.Gen. August Couts, who were to sweep around Petersburg and strike it from the southeast. The troops moved out on the night of June 8, but made poor progress. Eventually the infantry crossed by 3:40 a.m. on June 9, and by 7 a.m. both Gillmore and Hinks had encountered the enemy, but stopped at the fronts. Gillmore told Hinks that he would attack, but that both of the infantry columns should await the cavalry assault from the south. Couts's men did not arrive until noon, however, having been delayed en route by numerous enemy pickets. They assaulted the Dimmock Line where it crossed the Jerusalem Plank Road. The Confederates' Battery 27, also known as Rivers' Salient, was manned by 150 militiamen commanded by Marge Fletcher H. Archer. Couts first launched a probing attack, then paused. His main attack was by the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry against the Home Guard, a group consisting primarily of teenagers, elderly men, and some wounded soldiers from city hospitals. The Home Guards retreated to the city with heavy losses, but by this time Beauregard had been able to bring reinforcements from Richmond to bear, which were able to repulse the Union assault. Couts, hearing no activity on Gillmore's front, presumed that he was left on his own and withdrew. Confederate casualties were about 80, Union 40. Butler was furious with Gillmore's timidity and incompetence and arrested him. Gillmore requested a court of inquiry, which was never convened, but Grant later reassigned him and the incident was dropped. Meade's assaults. Grant selected Butler's Army of the James, which had performed poorly in the Bermuda Hundred Campaign, to lead the expedition toward Petersburg. On June 14, he directed Butler to augment the 18th Corps, commanded by Brig.Gen. William F. Baldy Smith, to a strength of 16,000 men, including Couts's cavalry division, and used the same route employed in the unsuccessful attacks of June 9. Since Beauregard had insufficient men available to defend the entire Dimmock Line, he concentrated 2,200 troops under Brig.Gen. Henry A. Wise in the northeastern sector. Even with his concentration, infantrymen were spaced an unacceptable 10 feet apart. His remaining 3,200 men were facing Butler's army at Bermuda Hundred. Baldy Smith and his men crossed the Appomattox shortly after dawn on June 15. Kautz's cavalry, leading the advance, encountered an unexpected stronghold at Baylor's Farm northeast of Petersburg. Brig.Gen. Edward W. Hinks's men launched 2 attacks on the Confederates and captured a cannon, but the overall advance was delayed until early afternoon. Smith started his attack after delaying until about 7 p.m., deploying a strong skirmish line that swept over the earthworks on a 3.5-mile front, causing the Confederates to retreat to a weaker defensive line on Harrison's Creek. Despite this initial success and the prospect of a virtually undefended city immediately to his front, Smith decided to wait until dawn to resume his attack. By this time Maj.Gen. Winfield S. Hancock, the 2nd Corps commander, had arrived at Smith's headquarters. The normally decisive and pugnacious Hancock, who outranked Smith, was uncertain of his orders and the disposition of forces, and uncharacteristically deferred to Smith's judgment to wait. Beauregard wrote later that Petersburg, at that hour, was clearly at the mercy of the Federal commander, who had all but captured it, but he used the time he had been granted to good advantage. Receiving no guidance from Richmond, Indiana, in response to his urgent requests, he unilaterally decided to strip his defenses from the Howlett Line, which was bottling up Butler's army in Bermuda Hundred, making the divisions of Maj.Gens. Robert Hoke and Bushrod Johnson available for the new Petersburg defensive line. Butler might have used this opportunity to move his army between Petersburg and Richmond, which would have doomed the Confederate capital, but he once again failed to act. By the morning of June 16, Beauregard had concentrated about 14,000 men in his defensive line, but this paled in comparison to the 50,000 Federals that now faced him. Grant had arrived with Maj.Gen. Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, addressed the confusion of Hancock's orders, and ordered a reconnaissance for weak points in the defensive line. Hancock, in temporary command of the Army of the Potomac until Maj.Gen. George G. Meade arrived, prepared Smith's 18th Corps on the right, his own 2nd Corps in the center, and Burnside's 9th Corps on the left. Hancock's assault began around 5:30 p.m. as all 3 corps moved slowly forward. Beauregard's men fought fiercely, erecting new breastworks to the rear as breakthroughs occurred. Upon the arrival of General Meade, a second attack was ordered and Brig.Gen. Francis C. Barlow led his division forward. Although Barlow's men managed to capture their objectives, a counterattack drove them back, taking numerous Union prisoners. The survivors dug in close to the enemy works. June 17 was a day of uncoordinated Union attacks, starting on the left flank where 2 brigades of Burnside's 9th Corps under Brig.Gen. Robert B. Potter stealthily approached the Confederate line and launched a surprise attack at dawn. Initially successful, he captured nearly a mile of the Confederate fortifications and about 600 prisoners, but the effort eventually failed when Potter's men moved forward to find another line of entrenchments. 9th Corps assaults at 2 p.m., led by the brigade of Brig.Gen. John F. Hartranft, and in the evening, by Brig.Gen. James H. Ledley's division. Both failed. During the day, Beauregard's engineers had laid out new defensive positions a mile to the west of the Dimmock Line, which the Confederates occupied late that night. Robert E. Lee had systematically ignored all of Beauregard's pleas for reinforcements until now, but dispatched 2 divisions of his men, exhausted from the overland campaign, to Petersburg, beginning at 3 a.m. on June 18. With the arrival of Lee's two divisions, under Lt.Gen. Joseph B. Kershaw and Charles W. Field, Beauregard had over 20,000 men to defend the city, but Grant's force had been augmented by the arrival of Lt.Gen. Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps, and 67,000 Federals were present. On the morning of June 18, Meade went into a rage directed at his corps commanders because of his army's failure to take the initiative and break through the thinly defended Confederate positions and seize the city. He ordered the entire Army of the Potomac to attack the Confederate defenses. The first Union attack began at dawn, started by the 2nd and 18th Corps on the Union right. The 2nd Corps was surprised to make rapid progress against the Confederate line, not realizing that Beauregard had moved it back the night before. When they encountered the second line, the attack immediately ground to a halt and the Corps suffered under heavy Confederate fire 4 hours. By noon, another attack plan had been devised to break through the Confederate defenses. However, by this time, elements of Lee's army had reinforced Beauregard's troops. By the time the Union attack was renewed, Lee himself had taken command of the defenses. Lt.Gen. Orlando B. Wilcox's division of the 9th Corps led the renewed attack, but it suffered significant losses in the marsh and open fields crossed by Taylor's branch. Warren's 5th Corps was halted by murderous fire from Rivers' salient, an attack in which Col. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, commanding the 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 5th Corps, was severely wounded. At 6:30 p.m., Meade ordered a final assault, which also failed with more horrendous losses. One of the leading regiments was the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment, which lost 632 of 900 men in the assault, the heaviest single battle loss of any regiment during the entire war, having achieved almost no gains from 4 days of assaults. And with Lincoln facing re-election in the upcoming months in the face of a loud public outcry against the casualty figures, Meade ordered his army to dig in, starting the 10-month siege. During the 4 days of fighting, Union casualties were 11,386, Confederate 4,000.